Somewhere on this planet right now, there is a wave taller than any building you have ever stood beside, gathering itself in total silence. Inside a fjord, nobody is watching. There is a border that was sketched out in a matter of weeks by men who never set foot on the land and is still cutting a country off from its own ocean 200 years later. And nearly a mile beneath the plains of South Dakota, in the absolute dark, something is passing through your body right now, through this room, through the entire earth, without leaving a single mark. We don't notice any of it. That's the unsettling part. The biggest forces on this planet are rarely loud. They sit quietly for decades, sometimes centuries, and then, for a few minutes, they rewrite everything. This is a story about three of them: a line, a wave, a ghost. Start with the line. In 1825, Russia and Britain needed to divide the far northwest of North America, and they needed to do it quickly. The land was remote, barely explored, frozen for half the year. So instead of sending surveyors to walk the terrain, the diplomats reached for the simplest tool available: a ruler and a rough sketch of the coast. Russia would get a narrow strip of mainland, never more than about 30 miles wide, following the shoreline. Everything beyond that belonged to someone else. On paper, it looked clean. In reality, nobody who signed that agreement had any real sense of what that coastline actually looked like. This is one of the most violently jagged shorelines on Earth. It isn't a smooth curve you can offset with a ruler. It's a maze of fjords, glaciers, and mountain ridges that fold back on themselves again and again. A boundary meant to be a simple buffer from the sea instead became an impossible knot, slicing through valleys, cutting river systems in half, and dividing indigenous communities who had lived along these waters for thousands of years, with no voice in where the new lines fell. Decades later, Russia sold the territory. The new owner kept the same border, in the same place, despite everything that had changed. And it's still there. That narrow ribbon of land runs uninterrupted along the entire coast, which means the country behind it, Canada, has no direct ocean access through this stretch at all. There are towns just a few miles from open water that are, legally, sealed off from it by a foreign strip of land that was never meant to last this long. There have been quiet disputes ever since. Arguments over fishing boundaries, over shipping routes, over exactly where a line drawn in a hurry 2 centuries ago should fall today. None of it has moved the border an inch. A decision made in a few weeks by people who never saw the ground has outlasted empires, outlasted the country that drew it, and is still shaping who can reach the sea and who can't. That's what an invisible line can do once it's written down. The ground doesn't get a say, but in this part of the world, the ground has other ways of making itself heard. Follow that same jagged coastline north, into the deep fjords carved out by retreating glaciers, and you find water that looks like some of the calmest, most sheltered on Earth. Steep cliffs rise straight out of glassy channels, sometimes barely wider than a few city blocks. It looks peaceful. It is not. What makes these fjords beautiful is exactly what makes them dangerous. Unstable slopes, holding back enormous volumes of rock and ice, sitting directly above deep, narrow water. In the open ocean, if a landslide slammed into the sea, the force would spread out in every direction and lose most of its power. In a fjord, trapped between rock walls, that energy has nowhere to go but up. In 2015, researchers began closely monitoring a slope above Tracy Arm, a fjord south of Juneau, after cracks started spreading across the mountainside. It was directly above water that tour boats and fishing vessels pass through daily. The slope never fully gave way, but scientists studying it knew exactly what would happen if it did, because something almost impossible to believe had already happened less than 200 miles from there, decades earlier. On July 9, 1958, an earthquake near Lituya Bay, Alaska, shook loose an enormous mass of rock, roughly 40 million cubic yards of it, straight into the head of the bay. The impact sent water climbing the opposite mountainside to a height of 1,720 feet. Sit with that number for a second. Not 1,700 feet of flooding along a shoreline. 1,700 feet up a mountain, stripping mature forest off the slope as if it had been shaved with a razor. To this day, it remains the tallest wave ever recorded on Earth, and it happened in a matter of minutes, inside a quiet bay most people had never heard of before or since. That's the truth scientists now watch for along the entire Alaskan coast. The fjords look serene because they're holding something back. The mountains aren't just scenery, they're stored energy, waiting on an earthquake, a thaw, or a single unstable afternoon to let go. If that's the scale of force hiding on the surface of this planet, you'd be forgiven for assuming the strangest mysteries of all live somewhere just as dramatic. They don't. Right now, one of the most ambitious physics experiments ever attempted is happening nowhere near a coastline. It's happening nearly a mile beneath the plains of South Dakota, in tunnels once carved out by gold miners, chasing a very different kind of fortune. An international team of scientists is building detectors designed to catch a particle so elusive that for decades, many physicists weren't sure it was even worth the effort. They call it, half-jokingly, a ghost particle, the neutrino. Neutrinos carry almost no mass and no electric charge, and they interact with ordinary matter so rarely that, at this exact moment, trillions of them are passing straight through your body and straight through the entire planet beneath your feet without leaving the faintest trace. That makes them almost impossible to study at the surface, where cosmic rays and background radiation would drown out any signal. So scientists buried the detector instead, thousands of feet of solid rock above it, filtering out the noise, leaving a clean, silent chamber where the only thing left to catch is the ghost itself. The scale of it is hard to picture. Massive tanks filled with tens of thousands of tons of liquid argon, cooled to nearly 200 degrees below zero. On the rare occasion, a neutrino strikes an argon atom inside that tank. It produces a faint flash of light and a brief trail of charged particles. Sensors lining the chamber catch that flash and reconstruct the ghost's path, almost like developing a photograph from a single instant of light. To make this work, a beam of neutrinos will be fired from a particle accelerator near Chicago, aimed straight through solid Earth. No tunnel required, since neutrinos barely register that rock exists, toward these detectors 800 miles away in South Dakota. Scientists will then compare neutrinos against their antimatter counterparts, antineutrinos, searching for the smallest possible difference in how the two behave. That tiny difference might be one of the most important numbers in all of physics. Because according to our cleanest equations, matter and antimatter should have been created in exactly equal amounts at the birth of the universe, and should have annihilated each other completely the instant they met, leaving nothing behind. No stars, no planets, no us. Something tipped that balance, just slightly, in favor of matter, billions of years ago. Nobody currently knows what. The ghost particles flickering through that liquid argon, nearly a mile under the Black Hills, may be the closest thing we have to an answer. A line drawn in a hurry that still decides who can reach the sea. A mountain wall, holding back a wave taller than anything we've built, waiting on a moment nobody can predict. A particle, crossing the entire planet right now, unnoticed, that might explain why anything exists at all. None of it asks for our attention. It never has. It just sits there, quietly, until the day it doesn't.